Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 2 to 8 player game Druids of the Elements being released by Rio Grande Games in the US. Druids comes with all of the components that you see here, including 48 total element cards, 72 total rune cards, 24 total forest tiles, separated into 8 elemental areas, 8 magic areas, and 8 virgin areas, 2 raven markers, a Path of Wisdom scoreboard, player components in the 5 different player colors, 40 gems, and a first player and active player marker. To begin setup, you'll construct the central play area. To do this, you'll gather 7 of the virgin tiles, all of the magic areas, and 1 full set of the elemental tiles, 1 each of the water, earth, air, and fire. You'll then shuffle these tiles and place them in the indicated pattern. The tiles need to be placed randomly, so when you're done, it might look something like this. Then place the scoreboard in the middle of the table, shuffle the element deck, and then reveal 2 cards from the deck. Then you'll form the rune deck by first gathering 12 cards per player. So in our 3-player example, we'll have 36, shuffling them and then laying out the top 2 to form a display. Then you'll randomly determine a player and give that player the first player and the active player markers. The active player token will be passed clockwise every turn, and the first player token will be kept by that player until the end of the game. Players will need to place the gems near the play area. Then each player will collect the player components in their color, including the hut token, which they'll place in front of themselves, their druid and wolf, and their player marker, which all players will place on the first space of the score track. Each player will then draw 2 each of the element and rune cards to place in their hand. Next, in turn order, each player will then place their wolf and druid token in a virgin space of their choice. It's important to note that these wolf tokens will only be used in the team variant of the game. And after this has been done, you're ready to play. In Druids, players will be attempting to move around the map, activate magic areas on specific tiles, and fulfill runes to gain victory points in an attempt to become the Archdruid. Beginning with the start player, who also has the active player marker in the beginning of the game, and then proceeding clockwise around the table, each player will take a turn, and on a player's turn they must perform 2 actions. Some actions may allow other players to take a follow action, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment, and the actions a player can take on their turn can be 2 different actions or 2 of the same actions.
And it's important to note that no player can have more than 8 cards in hand. If they would ever take an action or perform a rune effect that would cause more than 8 cards to be drawn, they can't take that action or perform that effect.
After a player takes their turn, they'll refill the display with any cards that they may have taken, and then the player would pass the active player marker to the next player in clockwise order. That's the general structure of a turn, but now that we've talked about that, let's look at each of the actions that a player could take on their turn in detail. The first action a player could take on their turn if they wanted to would be the cards action. With the cards action, a player can either draw element cards or rune cards. If a player chooses to draw element cards, they could either draw 2 from the deck or both of the face-up element cards in the display. If a player chooses to draw one of the rune cards, they could either draw 1 rune card face down from the deck, or one of the face-up rune cards. If they want to, after drawing cards, the active player can then discard 1 card from their hand, just placing the cards in a discard pile near the stacks. All of the non-active players wouldn't have any action available to them if a player selects this action. So after the active player draws cards, this action would be done. The next action a player could take on their turn would be the movement action. When doing this action, the active player would be able to move either their druid 1 space or their wolf 2 spaces. So for instance, the white player could choose to move their druid to this space here, or if they wanted to, they could choose to move their wolf to this space here or this space here, etc. It's also important to note that there's no limit to how many druids and or wolves can be in each hex, so this would be a legal move as well. There would be no follow action for any non-active players when this action is selected. The next action that a player could take on their turn would be the gem action. When taking this action, a player can generate a magic gem of a particular color, taking it from the main supply over here. To do that, a player would have to either discard 2 element cards of a particular color, color. Or if a player has a wolf or a druid standing on one of the element spaces, they could simply discard one card of the matching element and use the space on the board to pay for the other element. So in this instance, the white player could discard this one fire element, and since they've paid for the other element by standing on the matching space, they would then get to grab one gem of the matching color and place it in their supply. Then, in clockwise order, all of the non-active players would have a chance to generate an element of the matching color if they wish. So for instance, if the teal player had 2 red element cards, they could then discard them from their hand and gain a red gem as well. The yellow player would then have the option to do the same. It's important to note that there's no limit to the number of gems that a player can have in their personal supply, but they're not worth any points at the end of the game, so you want to make sure to spend them during the game to generate points if you can. The next action that a player could take on their turn is the Magic Area action. When taking this action, a player can activate the magic effect of any magic area where their druid or wolf is standing. They can either activate one area, or they could activate 2 different areas if they have 2 different spaces covered that would allow them to do so. When doing this, however, the actions would have to be different. So for instance, this player couldn't activate this magic effect twice, even though they have a wolf and a druid on 2 separate spaces. The active player gets to choose in which order the magic areas are activated, and all of the magic areas will have different effects. If a player activates the teleport location, they would then be able to move their druid or wolf to any area without any distance limits, regardless of which pawn is present in the teleport space. So for instance, the player could move this druid to any location they wish, or they could move the wolf to any location they wish. If a player activates the push magic area, they can move any druid or wolf, even if it belongs to another player, to an adjacent area. So for instance, this player could, if they wanted to, move this druid down here, or move this wolf over here, etc. If a player activates the convert gem magic area, they're able to change out one gem for another. So this player could change out this red one for a green one or blue, etc. If a player activates the duplicate gem magic area, they would be able to take a gem from the central supply that matches one that they already have. So for instance, they could grab one additional red gem since they already have one in their supply, duplicating it. Then, in clockwise order, each of the non-active players who have a druid or a wolf in any of the precise areas that were activated can then activate the matching effect as well. So for instance, the yellow player could activate the duplicate gem action in this example, but the teal or yellow player couldn't activate this convert gem magic area because they don't have a piece on the area. It's also important to note that no piece can activate a magic area more than once. So for instance, if this yellow player were activating the teleport action, they couldn't teleport to this location, for instance, and then push someone else. The last and most important action that a player can take on their turn would be the Rune Action. This action would allow players to activate runes either from their hand or the face-up runes in the display. After activating runes, they'll be placed face-up in display in front of the player that activated them. Once their immediate effects are done, they won't do anything else until the end of the game, and there are some runes that will only score based on in-game conditions. When a player takes the Activate a Rune action, they would have to select one of the rune cards either from their hand or one of the rune cards that's face-up in the display, and then they would have to pay the activation cost of the particular rune that they're trying to activate. The activation cost is listed here on the top of the rune cards, and these can be paid in one of 3 ways. A player could either discard an element card from their hand that matches the activation cost, in this instance by playing this fire element. They could pay the element if they're standing on a location that matches that element. For instance, this wolf standing here could activate this card, or they could discard from their supply a gem that matches the color and the activation cost. So by discarding this red element, the player could once again activate this card if they wanted to. Then the player might have to meet activation requirements listed on some cards. There are 4 different types of cards. There are ritual cards, consume cards, collective cards, and objective cards. Ritual and consume cards have requirements that have to be met before they can be activated. When activating a ritual rune, there have to be player pieces on the board that match the pattern on the card, either wolves or druids. So in this example, this pattern matches the card, because there are player pieces that form that pattern on the board. It's important to note, however, that a player has to use a druid piece to activate one of these ritual runes, and a player has to have a piece present in the pattern on the board to be able to activate that as well. So in this instance, both the white or the teal player could activate this rune because they have a player piece in the pattern that matches on the board, and they have a druid on the board in that pattern as well. It's important to note that the yellow player could not activate this ritual because even though they have a player piece in the pattern on the board, this player piece is only a wolf. Players have to use Druids to activate ritual cards. If a player is activating a consume card, they have to have the matching gems in their supply that they can then discard back to the supply to activate the card and get the victory points. For instance, if the player discarded these 2 reds and a white gem from their supply, they would then be able to score this card and add it to their row of cards for endgame scoring. If a player activates one of the collective runes, the effect applies for all players at the table. There's no activation requirement for these cards, but they're not typically worth very much points, although they can give you particular colors for scoring at the end of the game. That matters, and we'll look at that more in detail at the end of the video. And then finally, there are objective runes that, once activated, will be placed in a player's row just like normal, and they'll give players in-game scoring conditions that, if met, will give the player this number of victory points. For instance, if a player activates this rune and they're able to activate 4 total runes at the end of the game, they would get this 3 victory point reward. This objective card would give a player 3 points if they've formed 2 consecutive sequences at the end of the game, which we'll look at in more detail once again at the end of the video. Once a player has activated a rune and paid any activation costs and met any requirements that may have been necessary, they can then add the rune to one end of their row of cards, either the right side or the left side. Placement will matter at the end of the game because having certain colors lined up in a specific way can get you extra victory points. If you have 4 different colors lined up, you can get 3 extra points, or if you have 3 colors that are the same, you can get 3 extra points. We'll look at that in more detail with in-game scoring. After placing the card in their row, the player would then gain any victory points if applicable. Players can gain points immediately if they complete a consume, a ritual, or collective rune. Objective runes wouldn't be scored until the end of the game. So in this instance, this player would immediately gain 5 points for completing this consume rune. They would move their marker 5 spaces up on the score track to indicate this. After a player completes a rune, all of the other players in clockwise order could then complete a rune of the exact same color if they wanted to, either from their hand or from the face-up display. So for instance, after this player completes this red rune, the teal player and then the yellow player in clockwise order would have a chance to activate a red rune either from their hand, or they could activate this red rune right here. After a player has taken 2 actions on their turn, they would then pass the active player marker to the next player in clockwise order, and then that player would take a turn by completing 2 actions of their own. When the deck of rune cards is emptied, the end of the game would be triggered. Players will then take turns until everyone has had equal turns. There would be one final phase known as the Sabbath, and then final scoring would occur. After everyone has taken an equal number of turns, the Sabbath phase would commence. During this phase, beginning with the player that has the first player token and then going clockwise around the table, each player can activate a rune either from their hand or the table if there are still rune cards present. And this special round of activations can continue until either no player wants to or can activate any further runes. It's important to note that there's no limit to the number of runes that could be activated during this phase. For each rune activated during the Sabbath, the activation costs have to be paid, the activation requirements have to be met, and all of the effects have to be applied just like in the normal game. After the Sabbath, final scoring will take place. To complete final scoring, players will take the number of points that they've gained on the victory track from consume, ritual, and collective runes. They'll then add any victory points gained from objective cards, and then players would get 3 victory points for each type of rune sequence that they've formed. Players can form 2 different types of rune sequences, either multicolor or monocolor. If a player has 4 runes next to each other of different colors, that's a multicolor sequence. If a player has 3 runes of the same color next to each other, that's a monocolor sequence. It's also important to note that cards can be used in more than one sequence. So in this example, this player has 3 points from this sequence, 3 more points from this multicolor sequence, and then 3 additional points from this final monocolored sequence. After adding up all of these points, the player who has the most victory points would win the game. And if there's a tie, the player who activated the most runes would win the game. We've looked at the rules for a 3 and a 4 player game, but there are a number of different variants in the game as well. The first variant to look at is the Ravens variant for 2 players. For this variant, players would use all of the normal rules for a 3 player game with a few changes. The first change is that a player would control a Druid, a Wolf, and a Raven. The second change is that whenever the active player uses the card action, the other player would then have a chance to move their Raven to an adjacent location if they wanted to. And it's important to note that this is the only way that Ravens can move move during the game. And ravens will function like wolves in the magic area and rune actions. It's important to note that only 2 magic areas can be activated, just like in the 3 and 4 player game, even if the active player has a druid, wolf, and raven in 3 different magic areas. There's also an extended variant for 5 players and a team variant for 6 or 8 players, and we'll leave those for you to discover after you've played the 2 to 4 player game. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email me directly at thediceyreview@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer those questions for you if I can. Also, if you are enjoying the content that we put out, as always, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we put out new content in the future. Alright, thanks so much for watching everybody, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.